It was a Tuesday morning, the color of gunmetal and old regrets, when the knock came on the door, 3 slow raps, heavy and deliberate, like someone summoning ghosts they weren't sure they wanted to see. He didn't answer at first, because the coffee hadn't brewed yet and his knees hadn't quite remembered how to bend, but something in the way those knocks echoed through the hallway, not hurried, not panicked, just patient and final, made him feel like the silence would collapse if he didn't rise and meet it. So he pushed himself up from the old leather chair that had known more of his weight than any woman ever had, and he limped past the cold fireplace and the line of dusty boots by the door, one hand already trembling near the deadbolt, as if the door itself might swallow him whole once it opened. What he saw on the other side was not a man, not a neighbor, not even someone with words. It was a dog, just a dog, standing still in the pale light like a shadow that had lost its body. It was a German shepherd, large and lean in a way that made the ribs visible but not quite desperate, with eyes that looked like they'd been watching someone bleed out slowly and never looked away. There was something torn about its ear, something clotted at the edge of its fur, but it didn't growl, didn't cower, didn't bark, it just stared up at him with the kind of stillness that people mistake for calm but is actually just shock holding its breath. And behind that dog, maybe 30 feet down the gravel driveway, a truck was backing away with no plates, no logos, and no reason to have ever stopped in a place like this, where nothing changes and no one visits unless they're lost or running. The man didn't wave, didn't shout, didn't chase, he just watched that anonymous truck disappear behind the trembling branches of 2 dead birch trees, and he stood there until the frost on his porch began to sting through his socks. The dog didn't move either, not until he turned to go back inside, and even then it only took 1 step, not following, not begging, just staying close, like it had been told to wait by someone who never came back. And maybe that was what made him pause, what made him leave the door open longer than he normally would, just wide enough for the cold to follow him back inside, because he'd seen that kind of waiting before, in hospital rooms and bus stations and corners of the world where goodbye never came with a reason. He poured a second cup of coffee he didn't want, stared at it for a minute too long, and placed it on the floor near the open door, not out of kindness, not even out of pity, just because he remembered what it was like to be left standing outside in the wind without being asked why. The dog didn't drink it. Didn't sniff it. Didn't even look at it. Just curled its legs beneath its scarred body like something had gone out of it a long time ago, and whatever remained was just muscle memory and obligation. He closed the door eventually, not all the way, just to the crack, like someone waiting for a sound before they commit to silence. That night, the dog didn't leave. Didn't bark. Didn't howl. Didn't scratch or whimper or demand anything, it simply slept under the edge of the porch as if it had done so 100 times before, and the man, in return, left the porch light on and didn't tell himself why. The next morning, the coffee was still warm when he opened the door and found the dog in exactly the same place, eyes open, body still, like a sentry who'd forgotten who he was guarding. There was something in that stillness that unsettled the man, not fear, exactly, but recognition, the kind of quiet that comes after you've cried all the tears you're ever going to cry and decided to live anyway. He spoke then, only once, and only a whisper. "You got a name?" But the dog, true to whatever sorrow it had carried with it, just blinked once and looked past him, toward the gray trees and the road that never heard laughter. The man lit the fire that day, though it was barely cold enough to need it, and he moved the extra blanket from the back of the couch down to the floor by the hearth, not thinking about what that meant, not ready to admit to himself why he did it. At some point, sometime around late afternoon when the sun laid down like a dying soldier behind the pines, the dog finally crossed the threshold and curled up beside the fire, not asking, not waiting, just deciding. And the man, who hadn't shared his home with anything breathing in almost 9 years, didn't move the blanket, didn't speak again, didn't even look too long, because there's a kind of sacredness in the early moments of trust, and he'd learned long ago that talking too much to wounded things makes them vanish. For 2 weeks they lived in silence, an old man and a broken dog, orbiting each other like 2 lonely planets that used to be suns, passing meals and glances and time like they were trying to teach each other how to want again. Some nights the dog would whimper in its sleep, legs twitching, body jerking like it was trying to outrun a memory, and on those nights the man would sit up in his chair with a glass of bourbon and stare at the fire without blinking. And some mornings, the man would open his medicine cabinet and just hold the orange bottle for a long while before setting it down untouched, not because anything had changed, but because something had started to matter again. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't healing, not really. It was just a quiet agreement between two living things who'd seen too much, lost too much, and still chose not to disappear. But then one evening, right as the light was folding itself under the hills and the crickets were beginning to whisper to each other again, the dog sat up from its usual place by the hearth and walked to the door, stiff and slow and strange. The man followed, not quickly, not curious, just drawn, like a tide pulled by a storm it hasn't yet seen. When he opened the door, the air smelled wrong, like copper and smoke and something trying to hide. The dog growled then, low and hoarse, a sound like gravel being chewed by memory, and that was the first time the man saw its teeth. There were fresh tracks in the dirt, large ones, not tire marks but boots, heavy, deep, going toward the edge of the woods and stopping short, as if whoever made them had disappeared mid-stride. The dog sniffed the ground, ears back, tail still, body coiled tight like it was remembering something it wished it hadn't. The man said nothing, just looked out into the trees that had always been silent, always been still, but tonight, they felt like they were listening. He reached for the flashlight by the door, checked the batteries like he always did, and then paused when he saw the dog already waiting at the edge of the porch, eyes fixed on the place where the tracks vanished. And that's when he said it, soft, low, barely more than breath. "What are we supposed to find out there?" Now the wind stirred the trees like they were about to speak, and somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped that shouldn't have. The dog's answer came not in sound or stillness, but in the way it turned its head sharply toward the trees and bolted, fast, sudden, and unflinching, like it had seen a ghost wearing familiar shoes. The man, startled but not panicked, followed with the flashlight trembling in his hand, casting long ribbons of yellow light across the uneven path where boots had pressed deep into the earth like warnings written in mud. Branches scratched at his arms like old enemies trying to hold him back, and the cold air, thick with moisture and the smell of dying leaves, wrapped around his chest in a way that made his breath short and his memories long. He hadn't run in years, not since the day the sky fell silent over an empty bedroom and the phone never rang again, but something in the urgency of that dog's movement reminded his legs that purpose was stronger than pain. The flashlight caught glimpses of movement between the trees, not people, not animals, but the kind of motion that made the hairs on his arms rise like soldiers called to attention in the dark. And then he saw it, the dog, standing frozen near an old barbed wire fence half swallowed by ivy and rust, its nose pointed at something low to the ground and hidden in shadow. He stepped closer, careful, as if afraid his boots might crush whatever fragile truth lay beneath them, and when he reached the dog's side, he followed its gaze downward, to a box, small and dented, wrapped in a black garbage bag, duct-taped at every edge like someone had wanted to erase it from the world. There was no sound in that moment except for the clicking of the dog's nails on rock as it circled the box once and sat down beside it, as if guarding the grave of someone who hadn't been mourned right. The man knelt slowly, bones complaining, joints resisting, but heart pushing forward, and with a pocket knife that had opened more envelopes than secrets, he slit the tape and peeled the plastic away like peeling back skin from something wounded. Inside was a towel, blue, faded, stained, and wrapped inside that towel was a mess of things that didn't belong together, a child's shoe, a piece of chain with dried blood on the clasp, and a collar, thick leather, worn, engraved with a name that had been scratched out by something sharper than time. He didn't speak, couldn't speak, because words are no match for the kind of grief that doesn't belong to you but still finds a place inside your chest. The dog didn't look at the objects, didn't sniff, didn't react, just stared out into the trees again, as if waiting for something worse to arrive. And that's when the man heard it, faint, but real, the sound of a car engine revving once, far off, followed by the unmistakable slam of a metal gate locking into place. He stood then, clutching the towel without knowing why, and stared into the dark like it might offer him an answer if he waited long enough. The dog walked ahead, not fast, but sure, like it had walked this path before under different skies, maybe with someone else, maybe alone, and the man followed, because whatever this was, it had already pulled him in past the point of refusal. They came to a clearing not marked on any map, where the earth dipped low and the trees grew thin, and in that hollow, lit only by the flashlight's dying beam, was a shed, old, paintless, leaning like a drunk remembering how to beg. The dog stopped 10 feet from the door and sat again, still as a gravestone, eyes never blinking, body locked into something deeper than instinct. The man walked to the shed, the door half-hinged and humming with a quiet that wasn't quite silence, and when he pulled it open, it moaned like it had been holding in screams for years. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ammonia, rust, and something darker, the kind of stench that lives in your throat long after you've stopped breathing it. There were crates, cages, and ropes nailed into the beams, not tools, not farming gear, instruments of control, of containment, of cruelty. He stepped back, bile rising in his throat like guilt with no place to go, and he turned to the dog, who had not moved, not flinched, just waited, as if this was the place it had wanted him to see all along. Something cracked deep inside the man then, not rage, not even sorrow, just the slow, crumbling kind of ache that comes from recognizing that pain has a history, and someone wrote it down one victim at a time. He closed the shed door gently, not out of respect but finality, and looked down at the dog, whose eyes met his for the first time like it was saying, "Now you know." They walked back without words, the trail behind them cold and silent, the box still buried under leaves, the collar still clutched in his hand like an apology made too late. That night, he placed the collar on the mantel above the cold fire and sat with the dog at his feet, neither of them sleeping, both of them listening to a silence that no longer felt empty, but full of questions too large for dreams. And it wasn't until the wind outside pushed something against the window, soft, like paper or feather, that he rose, opened the door, and found it, a note, soaked around the edges, taped to the mailbox with the same kind of duct tape that had wrapped the box. The handwriting was rushed, nearly illegible, but the words still burned. If you're reading this, it's already started again. Don't let them take what's left. You know where to go. He held the note in his hands until the ink ran like tears down the page, and then turned to the dog, who was already standing, ears raised, eyes steady. And that was when he asked, voice barely above a whisper, words shaking like autumn leaves not ready to fall. "Who the hell did this to you?" "They did," came the voice from the woods, low, cracked, and unmistakably human, spoken like confession, not explanation, from someone who had buried too many things to count. The man froze where he stood, the note still clenched in his hand, the dog stepping forward now with slow, deliberate caution, not to attack, not to greet, but to verify something that the years had almost erased. Out from behind the birch trees stepped a figure wearing an oil-stained coat and a brimmed cap pulled low, his posture too familiar, too wrong, too impossible, and for a moment the man's breath caught so hard in his chest it felt like drowning in dry air. It was Roy, or what was left of him, a man the town had buried in its memory years ago, after the fire, after the silence, after the lie that said he'd gone west to die alone. But there he stood, boots caked in old dirt, eyes sunken with sleep he hadn't earned, and the unmistakable limp of someone who'd once crawled out of something burning but never quite made it all the way back. "They did this," Roy repeated, stepping into the porchlight with hands slightly raised, not in surrender, but in sorrow, like someone approaching a headstone that bore their own name. The man didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because every word felt like a betrayal of the silence they'd all chosen. The dog, however, moved first, not to Roy, but in front of the man, placing itself between the two like a barrier of breath and bone, not ready to forgive, not ready to forget. "They're running it again," Roy said, voice soft but shaking like a tree in a storm too tired to fall. "Whatever you found in that shed, that's just the edge of it, just the rot bleeding through." And then, as if yanked from memory, the man saw it, the same boots, the same tread, the same makeshift cages from back then, the same smell he'd once sworn was the worst thing he'd ever known until he'd stood in it again last night. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though the question sounded hollow even to himself, like asking the wind why it blows through empty churches. Roy looked at the dog, then at the collar on the mantel, then back at the man whose hands were now fists and whose eyes were fighting to stay dry. "You remember that summer, the one after Millie passed," Roy began, voice quiet but deliberate, when we kept hearing stories about lost pets, missing hounds, kids saying they saw trucks in the woods after dark. The man didn't nod, didn't need to, because he remembered everything, especially the sound of that one neighbor's voice cracking as he searched the creek for his bloodied beagle, or the way the sheriff told everyone to stop spreading rumors about devil worship and focus on their own backyards. They covered it up, Roy continued, moving to the steps but not climbing them, respecting the invisible line that still hummed between guilt and grace, told us it was nothing more than coyotes and kids with wild imaginations, but we knew better, didn't we? The man said nothing, but the dog growled then, low and long, like a thread being pulled from a torn seam, the kind that's been waiting too long to unravel. I stayed quiet after the fire, Roy said, his eyes drifting to the place where the old shed had once stood before it collapsed under its own weight, because they told me to, and back then, I didn't have anyone worth breaking silence for. But now, he said, stepping forward just once, now they've started again, and this time they ain't hidin', it's so far from home. The man lowered the note, the ink now blurred like old scars under new rain, and he stared into the woods behind Roy, where the shadows seemed too still, too careful, as if something out there knew it had been seen. How many? He asked finally, voice gravel thick and tired of holding back the years. Roy didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't soften the blow. More than we ever guessed, and they ain't just talking strays this time. At that, the wind picked up, strong and sudden, slamming the porch door against its frame like it had heard enough, and the dog let out a bark so sharp and sudden it cut straight through the marrow of the man's bones. Roy looked down, and for the first time, he crouched, slow, careful, hand outstretched, not to pet the dog, but to show the back of his palm, where an old brand, half-healed and wicked, twisted its way across his skin like a confession burned into flesh. They did this, Roy whispered, not angry, not afraid, just broken in a way that no amount of time could polish clean, same people who built the cages, same ones who think huntin' something smaller than you is some kind of birthright. The man closed the door gently behind him, the dog following at his heel, and without another word, they stepped into the night with Roy, past the trees, past the tracks, into the place where no one had gone willingly in a decade. And somewhere in the dark, just past the clearing where the shed had once rotted, they saw it, new tire tracks, new chains, and a single glove, too small to belong to any man, lying in the mud like a warning written in silence. Roy knelt and picked it up, turning it over once before holding it toward the man. Someone's still out there, he said quietly, voice barely holding together beneath the weight of what had already happened, and they're talking them for a reason. The man stared at the glove, then at the trees, then back at the dog, who stood unmoving, ears raised, eyes locked on something just beyond the light. And that's when he asked, softly, like someone opening a door they weren't sure they wanted to step through. What did they do to you, girl? She didn't answer with a sound or a glance or a whimper. Instead, she turned and ran, fast and silent, into the heart of the woods like a spirit that knew the path better than any map ever drawn. The man and Roy followed her through the thick underbrush, branches clawing at their coats, thorns snagging against their sleeves, the night around them heavy with the kind of darkness that feels old and unwilling to let go. The dog darted between trees with the precision of something that had once escaped through these woods in the opposite direction, chased by a fear that left scars deeper than teeth or wire. She stopped abruptly at a break in the earth, not a cave, not a hole, but a sunken patch of ground half covered by branches and stone, a place that felt forgotten on purpose. Roy stepped forward first, brushing aside the debris with a reverence that felt unnatural, like disturbing a burial, and when the last layer of leaves gave way, what they saw beneath made both men stop breathing for a moment that lasted far too long. It was a bunker, handmade, narrow, lined with tin and wood and silence, no larger than a closet, but inside, under the dim beam of Roy's flashlight, were the unmistakable shapes of cages, tools, and something worse, a video camera still mounted to the corner, red light blinking like an eye that had never closed. The man stepped inside, hand over his mouth, not because of the smell, though that alone could have turned a priest to ashes, but because of what he saw scratched into the walls, names. Dozens of names. Some crossed out, some not. Some paired with dates. Some with nothing at all. The dog sat at the entrance, not whimpering, not crying, just watching, like a witness who had already given her testimony and was waiting to see if someone would finally believe it. Roy leaned down and pulled open a cabinet near the back, and inside were files, manila folders with no labels, no photos, just pages and pages of numbers, weights, times, medical terms, and symbols the man didn't recognize but felt in his stomach like acid. They were keeping records, Roy whispered, turning the pages slowly, careful not to rip them, though part of him wanted to burn the whole place down with his bare hands, not just of animals, but people, runaways, drifters, the kind nobody comes looking for when they go. The man stared at the camera, still blinking, still watching, and he reached up slowly and pulled the wire from the wall until the light went out and the room finally felt empty. Then, from under one of the cages, the dog nosed something forward, a ragged piece of blanket, folded tight around a small plastic tag, the kind they put on livestock, not pets. The number on it was burned in, not printed. And beneath that number was a single letter. J. The man sank to his knees, not from pain, but the weight of knowing she hadn't just wandered onto his porch by chance, hadn't been dumped like trash by someone running from guilt, but had escaped something designed to make her disappear. She was one of them, Roy said, voice thick now, like every word had to pass through a throat full of broken glass, part of whatever they're running down here, a survivor. The man didn't speak, just looked at the dog, who now stared back at him with a kind of quiet that felt more human than most people ever learn to carry. They climbed out of the bunker without speaking, covering it as best they could with the same branches and stones, not to hide it, but because leaving it bare felt like leaving a wound open in the world. They walked back to the house in silence, but it wasn't the same silence they'd known before. This one was heavier, charged, not with fear, but with purpose neither of them had expected to find again. That night, as the wind howled against the glass and the dog lay curled beside the fire, the man sat at his kitchen table with the folder open in front of him, flipping slowly through the pages while Roy leaned against the sink with his eyes closed, whispering names like prayers too late to be heard. Then came the knock. Not loud. Not rushed. Just 3 slow raps. Exactly like the first time. The dog shot up instantly, her body rigid, teeth bared, ears forward, as if the sound itself had reached into her memory and pulled something out screaming. The man didn't move, not yet, just reached slowly under the table for the old shotgun he hadn't fired in years but kept oiled out of habit, and loaded it with shells he could still do by feel in the dark. Roy looked at him, then at the door, then nodded once, the kind of nod that says we may not get out of this, but we damn sure won't go down easy. The man stepped forward, opened the door without flinching, and standing there, soaked from the rain and shaking so hard she could barely hold the paper in her hands, was a girl. No older than 16. Clothes torn. Hair matted. Eyes wide with the kind of terror you can't fake and can't forget once you've seen it. And in her hand was a note, the same handwriting as before, trembling in the wind like a leaf too tired to hold on. She looked at the man, then at the dog, and whispered something so soft it barely made it past her lips. They're coming tonight. Roy stepped forward quickly, wrapped a blanket around the girl, pulled her inside while the man locked the door and turned out every light. The dog didn't sit by the fire this time. She stood guard at the window. Watching. Waiting. Remembering. And then the man looked at Roy, eyes hollow but steady, voice low like thunder beneath the floorboards. Why now? He asked. Because she remembered where she came from, Roy said, his voice trembling not from fear, but from the weight of truths long buried in silence and dust, and because she never forgot the sound of that girl's scream. The girl stood near the hearth now, clutching the blanket like a lifeline, her eyes darting between shadows on the walls as if they might leap out and drag her back into the place she'd barely escaped. The dog had not moved from the window, her body still locked in that taut stance between fight and flight, every muscle alert, every breath a warning, as if she knew that danger wasn't coming, it was already here. And then came the sound, faint, mechanical, deliberate, the low hum of tires moving slow over gravel, not rushing, not announcing, but creeping forward like guilt wearing a stolen face. The man turned out the final light, the one over the kitchen sink that had burned every night for the last 9 years, not because he needed it, but because he hadn't been ready for darkness to be total until now. Roy moved to the side door, checking the lock, then knelt beside the girl and asked her, in the softest voice a broken man can manage, "How many?" She swallowed hard, lips cracked, voice barely a whisper. 3, maybe 4. All men. All of them wore masks. One of them had a scar down his neck, like he'd been cut open and stitched back together wrong. The dog let out a growl then, not loud, not angry, just resolute, the kind of sound made not by fear, but by something that had already seen the worst and survived anyway. The man opened the drawer beneath the sink, pulled out a small key wrapped in tape, and handed it to Roy without a word. Roy nodded once, walked to the barn out back through the hidden passage behind the pantry, and emerged 5 minutes later carrying the lockbox neither of them had opened since the summer the orchard burned. Inside were papers, maps, keys, a rusted revolver, and a cassette tape labeled, "If They Come Back." The man held the tape in his hand for a long time, the weight of it heavier than any gun, and then he set it down beside the fire and turned to the girl. "Did they say what they wanted from you?" She nodded slowly, the tears falling now in quiet streaks down her dirt-covered cheeks, voice cracking with something no child should ever have to carry. "They weren't just hurting animals," she said. "They were training them. Teaching them to attack, to obey, to track." Roy looked up sharply, realization blooming behind his eyes like a bruise that spread too fast. "It was never just a kennel," he muttered. "It was a program." The man closed his eyes, the pieces falling into place now like rusted dominoes, slow and jagged, too sharp to touch but impossible to ignore. "They're building something," he said quietly, "not just breaking things." The girl looked at the dog then, the dog who had saved her, the dog who had somehow made it back here, the dog who had once worn a collar with a name carved out of her like it didn't belong to her anymore. And then she said the words that finally made everything stop. She was one of them, but she turned on them. She got out. She led me here. No one spoke. No one breathed. And then, outside, a light flashed, once, twice, 3 times, followed by the sound of a car door closing with that soft, deliberate click that only feels gentle when you're too far away to be in danger. The man raised the shotgun, cocked it slowly, and looked at Roy with a nod that felt like goodbye, then turned to the girl and said, "Stay behind the stove, don't move unless I tell you, and no matter what you hear, don't scream." Then he opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, the dog beside him like a shadow made of fury and memory, the two of them side by side as if they'd been waiting for this moment all their lives. Out there, beneath the dead stars and the indifferent moon, stood 3 men in black coats and plastic smiles, holding nothing but confidence and cruelty in their hands, no badges, no names, just the look of men who thought the world belonged to them because no one had ever told them otherwise. "Evenin'," one of them said, stepping forward like this was just another handshake waiting to happen. "We're looking for something that wandered off. You wouldn't have seen a stray come through here, would you?" The man didn't answer. The dog stepped forward. And the look on that man's face changed the moment her eyes met his, because monsters know each other when they meet in the dark. He stepped back. Too late. The dog leapt. The gun fired. The night cracked open. And when it was over, when the smoke cleared and the blood stopped steaming in the cold, only one of the intruders was left breathing, crawling toward the truck with a sob in his throat and a stain on his conscience that would never wash clean. The man walked over to him, shotgun empty, hands steady, and looked down with eyes that didn't blink. "You sent her here," he said. The man on the ground coughed, nodded, whispered through blood and broken teeth. "She wasn't supposed to remember." The dog growled once. And then lay down beside the girl, who came out from behind the stove like she'd just learned how to stand for the first time. Roy came out last, bandaged arm, pale face, but still breathing, and he knelt by the fire, picked up the cassette tape, and turned to the man. "Should we listen to it?" he asked, voice hoarse, but whole. The man looked at the dog. Then at the girl. Then back at the blood on the floor. And finally, he smiled, a small, broken thing, but real. No, he said. We already know the truth. And as the wind rose outside, carrying the scent of pine and gunpowder, the dog laid her head in the girl's lap, her eyes finally closing, not from pain, not from fear, but peace. Because she'd made it back. Because she'd led someone home. Because the last thing they took from her was never her body, it was her purpose. And tonight, she took it back. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.